Today there is one topic that I really want to talk about. The heroic timeline. Because this is potentially episode 0 in a hypothetical series on the subject, I will only be covering a summary of the whole of the lore that I have in mind for this particular franchise. These are just key notes, the most important details to remember if you wish to attempt to expand on this fictional alternate timeline. And that is an extremely important detail to remember. This is a fictional alternate timeline, and thus distinction needs to be made between the real world timeline, the one that you and I actually live in, and the heroic timeline, which is where Hero Team and related stories occur. In this fictional alternate timeline, where dreams come true and success is correlated with effort, I would have crossed paths with my perfect girlfriend, Amanda. And this is where the timeline officially forks from the real-world timeline. Such a meeting was supposed to happen in the early 2010s, around when I was still in college. So before that point, everything happens exactly as it does in our world. And that alignment on the timeline makes sense as Hero Team as a franchise was originally conceived in December of 2010. On the heroic timeline, the 2010s are most important for being the infancy of the future of special forces, known as the United States Super Soldiers. And it's been my personal dream to be the actual very first super soldier, as documented in an unpublished novel titled Prototype Hero. But there's more to this world than simple wish fulfillment. It's that this thought is what starts the entire process. And thus on this timeline, if anyone is genuinely capable of making it real, it would be the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. Throughout the 2010s, there were two presidents who were the commander-in-chief of the military during their terms. There was President Obama and President Trump. And this is extremely important to remember because they both handled the super soldiers very differently. Obama uses them like a scalpel, while Trump uses them like a sledgehammer. The oldest comics I personally drew, the ones that were done with actual colored pencils, were set during the Obama period, the very infancy of this group of special forces, conducting black operations and some of the subtlest political shenanigans possible, as well as permanently erasing certain entrenched criminal elements that were too much of a threat, be it politically or physically, for the legal enforcers to appropriately dispel. Never send a civil servant to do an action hero's job, and that's exactly what Hero Team was built for. Hero Team itself was a little more complicated, as they were not heroes in a moral black and white sense, but rather in a patriotic war hero sense. And while the details under the surface are sometimes very ugly, they still do uphold the oath of defending the American culture from both foreign and domestic threats. But the difference in politics was particularly important when Trump entered office in 2017 after winning the 2016 election. From there, his unapologetic America First attitude, juxtaposed with the numerous military bases across the entire planet, had left the global international community concerned that the United States was in a position to rise up into becoming a power akin to a global empire. And while that prediction would come true, they were decades off the mark, and I will discuss that later when it becomes more applicable. This is the point in time where the Hero Team trilogy occurs. It is 3 books. Volume 1, The Horror of War. Volume 2, The Glory of Battle. And Volume 3, The Thrill of the Kill. And in universe, this is an actual document that the first super soldier himself wrote. which is known as Thesis on Modern Warfare from the perspective of a super soldier. What's important is that Donald Trump had failed to appease the international stage diplomatically. Stubbornness, boldness, inner strength. In this timeline, Donald Trump was truly a badass. But on the other hand, under his watch, World War III happened, and the kickoff was on June 9, 2018 in the heroic timeline, at the Battle of DC and the climax of Volume 1. This was the moment when super soldiers were no longer no such agency and became public knowledge. For the devastation they brought was on the same scale as the 2 nuclear bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in World War II. And though the super soldiers of the time had varying levels of combat experience, Hero Team obviously being the most senior of them, this would be the time they would truly rack up the remarkable counts in their metrics and performance, both glorious and grim alike. World War III would forever change the map of the entire Earth. Though it only lasted a couple years, which is a fraction of the time of any of the other world wars, it was just as deadly. The Middle East got bombed into being called Glassland, Japan got nuked with the fallout blowing into China, and the very end of North Korea by turning their own nuclear missiles against them was single-handedly a masterstroke by Hero Team acting all by themselves. For remember, this situation is the USA against everybody in the world combined. And the only thing that could stop the momentum of both the United States as a nation and its secret weapon, the super soldiers, would come from within. In 2020 and 2021, in the heroic timeline, Donald Trump wins re-election. And the January 6th debacle transpired instead across 2 equally extreme factions of the political spectrum. It was truly civil war in Washington, D.C. Thus, World War III got interrupted by Civil War II, bringing the super soldiers back home to fight domestic threats. World War III had technically not ended, much like the Korean War of the real world. It was a ceasefire because Civil War II interrupted World War III. And that's going to be very important later. Civil War II, in short, was a necessary but very ugly massacre. And finally, as if things couldn't get any worse, 2023 happened, which introduced the coronavirus. COVID is a real thing in the heroic timeline. It's just conceived a few years later compared to its birth in the real timeline. And there's a reason COVID is known as the Shadow Dictator. Throughout 2023 of the heroic timeline, COVID would be the one truly determining political behavior across the world. And those who resisted and refused were destroyed not by stormtroopers, but by natural selection. That one very specific detail is a theme across the entire heroic timeline. COVID's punishment was universal and indiscriminate. And while Hero Team had undergone government-required solitary confinement for their own protection, their families and loved ones succumbed to varying degrees of absolute devastation. Amanda's was especially destroyed, as she was the only survivor at the time of her whole bloodline. Her parents, her siblings, her uncles, they were all dead from COVID. And as for her husband, those family members ended up on permanent disability as a direct result for the same behavior. Between this rampant mental illness of anxiety and depression, social isolation, and feelings of despair in general, this period of time would be known as the Great Implosion. And yet, it was not a time of war, so people instead called it the Great Peace. Or to furthermore explicitly create the parallel of World War I, it was also called the Peace to End All Peace. Even Donald Trump early on in COVID died to COVID. So unlike the real world timeline, which has an entire movement specifically resisting decrees based around COVID, That mindset was quickly and decisively shut down by the death of Trump. Those who pretended things were normal were punished severely, not by any police officer, but by the virus proper. At the end of it all, around the middle of the 2020s, the dust could finally start to settle. And this is when Joe Biden was elected into office, when half the human population across the globe grand total was halved. And though the human race still stood 10 digits strong, an actual halving of the population would be noticed by everybody. Altogether, commutatively, from 2018 to 2023, this would be known as the false apocalypse. And put together, this would make the millennials into the new greatest generation, as they now became known as the World War III veterans. The 2020s and especially the 2030s were a much quieter time when the world was still picking up the pieces and asking some very existential questions. It was a time of reflection, a time of mourning. A universal somber swept the whole of the human race. And the so-called Zoomer generation would be raised in that direct aftermath of the false apocalypse. Their parents would have lived to see all of the devastation, both physical and mental, combined. Where China retooled as an agrarian society that explicitly forbids use of technology for fear of another World War III crisis, the United States tried to plug its holes in work productivity with robotics and automation. Of all the nations, the United States was the one that was closest to remaining intact, especially comparatively. But that said, even the United States was humbled, and Joe Biden had absolutely perfected the representation of that. To Trump's credit, even if posthumously on this timeline, he was correct in referring to this president as Sleepy Joe. And yet, that's exactly what the situation called for given the context of the aftermath caused by the false apocalypse. The United States was humbled, while the rest of the world was anywhere from devastated to wiped entirely off the map. But the super soldiers truly did not like Joe Biden, as he was an intense pacifist as a direct result of World War III. And thus, given an abhorrence for the super soldiers and everything they stood for, they would be the first to receive budget cuts from this new administrative government. The 2030s would be known as the time that the United States would more calmly reopen the questions that Civil War II attempted to inquire about. Though everyone learned their lesson to not violently revolt against the government, lest they incur the wrath of the whole super soldiers, even with budget cuts, the destruction of the extremist factions was not enough to outright kill the ideas that they brought to the political discussion. And so returns the polarized, divisive nature of the bipartisan American system of government. Eventually, the absurdity knew no bounds, so a very unlikely personality had to step up into the political arena. Trey Parker and Matt Stone of Colorado. They witnessed the Make America Great Again mantra and what it did for Trump, as in arguably bring about World War III. Yet they were equally disgusted by the opposite end of the political spectrum celebrating mental illness. Thus, they ran as an independent libertarian party for presidency. Not counting George Washington, Trey Parker and Matt Stone would be the first third-party president in the White House. And their electoral terms defined the 2030s and through most of the 2040s. In this period of the timeline, we reach the short bus generation. They had been known that because statistically of all children going to school throughout those years of the last 2030s and into the 2040s, the overwhelming majority were in special ed. On the order of 75% of all students of the time. Standard classes still existed, and so did GT, the gifted and talented that were the academic elite. But they became a staggeringly small minority of students. And there are numerous reasons for that. First of all, in the 2040s, this is when the automation age was in full swing, where the 2010s and 2020s saw the mere prototypes of artificial intelligence and dynamic self-improving program algorithms. It would be here on this part of the timeline that those processes would become perfected. In addition, the real-world Baxter robot that does exist has become transformed into what is known as Alfred. Named after the humble servant of Batman and popular culture, Alfred was a fully autonomous, self-sufficient robot butler, and upon release was available for public consumption for a prohibitively high cost, making it a luxury item and a toy for the rich. All these machines are leaving humans not unemployed, but unemployable, to the order of 90% of the entire human population within the surviving United States of America. This made the children in the short bus generation question why education was even important to begin with, since they would never even actually use any of it. And though some of those points were valid all the way in the baby boomer generation almost 100 years ago, here it became absolute. So whether through mental illness, lack of motivation, personality quirks, or actual retardation, there was good reason for calling the kids of the time the short bus generation. And this is where the hero team stories end and the short bus stories begin. The most important lore-related development would be the birth of two very specific girls, Violet and Scarlet. And they were both biologically born from the same Jay and Amanda who fought in World War III and through the original Hero Team comics. Which is why and how their military-styled berets are emblazoned with the image of the Hero Team insignia. Those two girls are the living, breathing legacy of the original Hero Team. Violet and her friends may have had numerous stories and adventures of varying absurdity, but it was Scarlet who was destined to shape the future of the world. Matt Stone and Trey Parker had failed to rein in the legislature polarity and the apathetic judicial branch. Both Trey Parker and Matt Stone described it as, in their exact words, soul-crushing. Yes, the checks and balances were functioning exactly as intended, but it kept politics completely deadlocked. And just when frustration was coming to a head, that is when the aliens came. The conservatives wanted to go down fighting, but the liberals thought it would be more practical and pragmatic to submit to them for continued existence. And Congress had a Democratic majority at the time, which determined the fate of the United States in the context of these invaders. They were monsters, demons, freaks, and yet the far left cheered as they came parading through the streets. For the first time in history, the human race was no longer the masters of the earth, and the liberals loved it. This is the story of The Way of the Badass. For those who do not know about that video game project I attempted to make a couple years ago, this is when Scarlet takes the spotlight for the very first time. July 2045. Her parents go to investigate the situation and remain missing for a noticeable amount of time. Scarlet was the designated survivor, so she went up eventually to look for more supplies and any word for her parents and her sister. This is when she came across the Kingdom of Badass and her personal lieutenant, Duke Pope. The aliens and monsters had humanity on an incredibly tight leash. But it wasn't the authoritarian nature that made Scarlet go violent. It was the fact that the humans were not the masters of the earth anymore. And the Kingdom of Badass was very upfront about it. This wasn't just about liberation. This was about human supremacy. This is when certain far-right elements, such as Karl Schultz, the Nazi stormtrooper of the time, had rallied under Scarlet's rule. as her father had earned the title the King of Badass. He was the unchallenged, unquestioned #1 of all the badasses. And now Scarlet, through her adventures here becoming the reincarnation of Joseph Mengele, ends up as the #2 on their competitive leaderboard. And through those adventures, Scarlet becomes truly the Princess of Badass. It is important to note that the Kingdom of Badass is a dictatorial meritocracy, and its ideologies and hierarchy would be the proof of concept for Scarlet's later ambitions. Again, we'll get to that when it becomes applicable. Several weeks later, and if Civil War II were a massacre, then Scarlet's crusade was nothing short of a full, successful genocide. And the darkest detail, this would be only the first of numerous genocides that Scarlet would single-handedly spearhead and accomplish. The rainbow blood on the knife became a visual symbol of destroying the very ideology of the far left. Because it doesn't matter what labels you have, it doesn't matter what color your hair is, they all bleed the same. Yet not too long later, Carl was extremely confused when Scarlet was targeting the stupidity of the far right. Their unchecked fake news propagation and lies about questioning known facts, ranging from coronavirus to the state of other crises, had resulted in a similar purge from Scarlet to violently shut down this fake news. And when attacking both ends of the spectrum, Scarlet would tell them her famous one-liner. Does this look like the face of hate to you? No, it was not hate. It was sadism, backed by a cruel but reasonable ideology. Such a story was supposed to be told in Enter the Badass, the hypothetical sequel to the game The Way of the Badass. For it is important to understand that The Way of the Badass does not morally discriminate. Heroes and villains can both be equally badass. The violence during these stories was not a matter of good versus evil. It was a matter of toughness and coolness destroying the weak and meek. Between those two epics, and defeating the tyranny of school in the tiny book Sic Semper Tyrannis, Scarlet was a hero to the whole of the human race. And she was just a little kid, an adorable redhead girl. And yet the masses clung to her every word, even as she compels them to question everything. This would be the very beginning of Scarlet's rise to power. And the seeds were planted for an empire to rise decades in the future. The farther we go through the heroic timeline, the less set in stone things become, but there are still a few particularly consistent details at this point. Specifically, Scarlet enjoyed her childhood and adolescence throughout the next few years. The 2060s, she would have to confront college to get her degree, so she would become a super soldier and follow in her parents' footsteps. Despite the process of schooling having a horrific effect on Scarlet's mental health, she did eventually overcome this problem. And the 2060s were marked by her 10-year tenure as a Black Beret for the United States Super Soldiers. Though this was her personal dream, by the end of it and the start of her 10th year of service, Scarlet started to get bored with the lifestyle. Not because there wasn't anything to do, but because there was nothing the crooks could throw at her that she hadn't already destroyed 1,000 times before. And so, in the 2070s, once Scarlet's 10 years were done, and she had been bored with the anti-climax of life in the super soldiers at the time, we begin to see what is known as the Immortal or the Imperial generation, and the reasoning for both of those names will be self-evident in time. Scarlet runs for political office and eventually becomes President of the United States through any means necessary. And generally, while the voter counts were legally valid, Scarlet called upon numerous questionable favors to boost her platform. In the end, when the votes were tallied, all that mattered was that Scarlet was now the President of the United States of America, and her 2 terms of 8 years long would be nothing short of awe-inspiring. Hard but fair, she knew how to motivate the masses to strive to be their best selves possible. and her time as a Black Beret was well put as she was leading from the front. It was very rare for her to be seen at the Oval Office because she was busy going across the entire world to advance her agenda. And it was the agenda she set back in The Way of the Badass, that the human race is the master race. People wanted to innovate. People wanted to explore. People wanted to do things with their lives outside or even inside of virtual reality. And just when people thought they were comfortable enough to declare themselves at the technological finish line, Violet pushed to go to Mars. And with the combined power of the two sisters, this brought the world into a golden age. There were still problems brewing under the surface and loose ends to tie, such as World War III. Remember how I said that World War III was interrupted by Civil War II and never had a satisfactory conclusion? Part of Scarlet's promise was to end World War III with a victory for the United States. Because the rest of the world knew this would be an outright steamroll, this brought peace and victory in the most anticlimactic way possible. And yet, technically, it did mean Scarlet delivered on her promise. But there were still problems on Earth. And man-made or not, that was not important. Ending the 2070s, Scarlet would have to face her destiny at the end of her second presidential term. At this point, the situation of Earth's environmental climate had become dangerous. There was a literal boiling sea, and the temperatures of Antarctica would seem like modern-day United States in the real timeline of the 2020s. In short, with COVID, climate, nuclear, and fake news, the crises were real. And just as Scarlet was about to get into gear to annihilate those problems the same way she annihilated the subservient breeds in The Way of the Badass, her second presidential term ended, and if she were under a purely legal path, she would be forced to step down from power. There was still a popular support for Scarlet in a what-if poll saying, if Scarlet could run again, would you vote for her? The answer was overwhelmingly yes, upwards of 75 to 90%. And depending on which state was polled, anywhere from 33% to 70% would say yes, they want Scarlet to rule for life. Those who tried to force her out of office come the time of the peaceful transition of power met a very peaceful but very powerful resistance from Scarlet and her supporters. She had all the cards. The military was on her side, the scientists were on her side, her family was on her side, the super soldiers especially were on her side. And even the other nations that survived to this point conceded that the circumstances held the world at gunpoint. So if anyone can save the human race from actual extinction, it was Scarlet. This would mark the beginning of the world of emergency, the single darkest period in the whole heroic timeline. For frame of reference, the false apocalypse and World War III specifically would be the second darkest. Let that sink in. The period of history that halved the whole human population wins the silver medal for the nastiest chapter. Even then, Mars was hardly a colony, so there was no Plan B and no Planet B. And Scarlet was beholden to the same existential threats of nuclear, biological, environmental, and information. As the situation grew increasingly dire, her grip became more authoritarian. And democracy died with thunderous applause. For her third term wouldn't just be a simple third presidential term of 4 years. It would be the birth of the global empire that the United Nations had predicted all the way back at the start of World War III. But with unlimited power in her hands, Scarlet did an absolutely incredible job at single-handedly conquering these issues. So much, in fact, people began to question the separation of church and state, saying that Scarlet was the avatar of God Almighty itself. And by the end of the world of emergency, Scarlet was a female god emperor of all of Earth. She never married because she never wanted anyone to be in a position that could question or challenge her absolute power. She would strive to replicate her gene template as it was, quote, the perfect human, end quote. And those synthetically bred from that template were known as the Children of Scarlet. They were her knights, her inquisitors, the evolution of the United States super soldiers. And should the time call for it, they were her space marines. The sky started to sing Latin as huge heat sinks got shot into orbit to radiate the excess heat and cool the Earth. Nuclear power and sustainable fusion brought energy for countless millennia to come, even with the finite uranium in mind. And though Scarlet ensured that they would never be a Marxist or socialist society, but a Darwinist one instead, her dictatorial meritocracy took on its final form as the global empire. This is where the short bus stories end. And this is as far as the most concrete canon of the heroic timeline reaches. Anywhere beyond here is speculation and inconsistency. As for this production, this is an episode 0 of a hypothetical series I may or may not feel like actually creating. If I do more like this, I would like to focus more narrowly on the different sections, the different chapters, and different historic concepts or characters, or just the lore. If you leave a comment or send me a nice email, you may actually nudge me to do more like this. But for now, remember the super soldier mantra. Even in peace, we are always at war. Semper Bellum.